let's talk about the representational theory. Essentially, it suggests that our ability to talk about the world relies entirely on our internal mental models of reality. So, when we use language, we're not just describing external things at face value, but rather, we're referencing a kind of mental picture or conceptual understanding we have inside our minds. Under this view, language functions as a way to represent a theory. That is, a structured set of ideas about the kinds of things and situations that exist out there in the world. Now, this contrasts with referential theories, which focus more on how language is grounded directly in external reality. Instead, the representational approach emphasizes how reports about reality are shaped by our conceptual structures, by how we internally organize and interpret what we see and experience. So, meaning, in this perspective, is really about how our conceptualizations are conventionalized within a specific language. It's about how these shared mental models and structures form the basis for our understanding and communication. This approach is important because it helps us see how language reflects not just external facts, but also the internal frameworks we use to interpret those facts, tying into the broader theme of how language and cognition interact. Let's explore how referential theory struggles when it comes to words like unicorn or Santa Claus. These words lack objective reference in the physical world, so it's hard to explain their meaning based solely on pointing to real things. That's where representational theory comes in. It suggests that a word is meaningful because it's connected to a mental representation in our minds. This way, we don't need the thing to actually exist outside our minds for the word to have meaning. Instead, reference is directed toward things as they exist within our psychological experience, which is how we perceive and interpret the world around us. This approach helps us understand how we can talk about entities that don't exist physically, but still have meaning in our language and thought. It's a crucial step in overcoming the challenge of non-existent entities in language. A major challenge for referential theory is explaining how different expressions can refer to the same object, like the morning star and the evening star, but still have different meanings. The representational approach introduces the idea of sense as a mental bridge between words and the world. Expressions that refer to the same thing can still differ in sense because they represent different modes of presentation, or ways that our minds grasp that object. In this framework, sense is considered primary because it provides the cognitive criteria that make reference possible in the first place. So, even if two expressions point to the same thing, they can do so through different senses, highlighting the importance of how we mentally represent objects. This distinction helps us understand how language connects to our thoughts and perceptions in a nuanced way. Early representationalists thought that maybe mental representations of meaning were just visual images in our minds. But this approach ran into problems, especially with common nouns like triangle. You see, different people might picture a triangle in slightly different ways, so these images weren't consistent enough to serve as a reliable meaning. To address this, theorists proposed a different idea. Instead of mental images, they suggested that the representation is more like an abstract concept. Think of it as a mental definition rather than a picture. For example, a triangle isn't just a shape you see in your mind. It's a three-sided polygon, which is a propositional description. This shift is really important because it allows us to understand not only concrete objects like triangles, but also more abstract ideas like justice or love. These concepts can't be easily depicted as simple pictures, but they can be captured through their defining features or properties. So, moving from mental images to abstract concepts helps us better explain how we understand and represent both tangible and intangible ideas, fitting into the broader goal of understanding how meaning works in our minds. Let's explore how the representational theory looks at lexicalized concepts. These are concepts that are captured by a single word in a language. Now, whether a concept becomes lexicalized often depends on how useful it is and how frequently people need to refer to it in daily life. For example, some ideas are so central or common that they develop their own words. As society and technology evolve, we constantly invent new concepts and assign new labels to them. Think about the term microwave replacing microwave oven. This change reflects how language adapts to our needs, making communication more efficient. This process shows us that linguistic meaning isn't static. It's a dynamic mental store that expands and shifts based on cultural and cognitive requirements. So, in essence, our language evolves alongside us, shaping and being shaped by our collective experience and understanding. One way to define mental representations is through necessary and sufficient conditions, where a concept is essentially a list of essential attributes. However, as straightforward as that sounds, it's actually quite challenging to identify the essential attributes for natural kinds. For example, if a zebra is born with a defect and loses some stripes or even a leg, it still remains a zebra. That shows how tricky it is to pin down a strict set of features that define natural categories. Additionally, we often use words successfully in everyday language without knowing the technical definitions of what makes something a beech or an elm. We don't need to know all the necessary attributes to communicate effectively. This brings us to an important point. Mental representations must be more flexible than rigid, dictionary-style lists of features. Language and thought are adaptable, and our mental models need to reflect that flexibility. So, the challenge to the idea of necessary and sufficient conditions is that they don't fully capture how we actually understand and use concepts in real life. Our mental representations are more nuanced and adaptable than strict feature lists. Let's talk about how we can better model mental representations of concepts. Researchers have proposed the prototype theory, which suggests that our understanding of categories is structured around central or typical members. For example, within the category bird, a sparrow is considered a more central prototype than a penguin. This idea helps explain why there are fuzzy boundaries between categories, because some members are more representative than others. Borderline uncertainty, or how we sometimes struggle to classify an item, comes down to its distance from the central prototype. Take a whale, for instance. It's a mammal, but not a typical one like a dog or a cat. So the whale is a non-typical member of that category. When we evaluate whether something belongs in a category, we compare it to memories of actual typical instances we've encountered, what we call exemplars. Our mental system computes membership based on how closely a new item resembles these familiar examples. Overall, prototype theory and the idea of fuzzy boundaries help us understand how our minds organize complex information about the world, allowing us to make quick, flexible judgments even when categories overlap or are not sharply defined. Let's talk about how we, as speakers, hold what are called folk theories about the world, which are shaped by our experiences and cultural backgrounds. These are often referred to as frames or ICMs, idealized cognitive models. Now, these aren't scientific definitions. Rather, they are collections of cultural views that influence how we use words. For example, take the word bachelor. Most of us understand it within a specific marriage ICM, meaning it involves romantic love and being eligible for marriage. This cultural model helps us quickly grasp the concept. But here's the interesting part. That's why we might hesitate to call a celibate priest or someone like Tarzan a bachelor. They don't fit the idealized cultural model of a bachelor because they don't meet the typical criteria we associate with that role. So, these ICMs and frames are crucial. They shape not just our understanding of words, but also how we interpret the world around us. This connects to our overall theme of how language and cognition are deeply intertwined with our cultural and experiential backgrounds. When we look at cognitive semantics, we see that metaphor is actually a core process in how we understand the world, not just a decorative detail. It helps us grasp abstract concepts, like life, by connecting them to more concrete ideas, such as a journey. This mapping from the familiar to the unfamiliar is key. It's important to remember that this process is asymmetrical, meaning we usually transfer features from the source domain to the target, but not the other way around. So, when we think of life as a journey, we borrow certain qualities from journeys, like movement or progress, without necessarily applying all those features back to the idea of life itself. Using metaphor, representational theory shows us how our minds organize vast, complex areas of experience through systematic correspondences. This concept of conceptual mapping through metaphor helps explain how we make sense of the world by linking different domains in meaningful, structured ways. It's a powerful tool for understanding how language and thought work together to shape our perception of reality. To avoid the problem of circularity, representational theory seeks to ground meaning in something more fundamental, and that's where image schemas come into play. These schemas are derived directly from our bodily experience. For example, the containment schema comes from how we physically experience our bodies as bounded spaces, leading to metaphors like being in love or inside something. It's about how our physical sense of boundaries shapes our understanding of concepts. Then there's the path schema, which originates from our movement through the world, how we navigate space and change location. This schema underpins our understanding of purpose as a kind of destination or goal that we move toward. What's really important here is that these prelinguistic structures, these schemas, form the experiential basis for how we derive meaning. They connect the way we speak and think to the way we physically exist and move in the world. This grounding in bodily experience helps explain how language is so deeply intertwined with our physical reality and perception. Mental spaces are essentially discourse-based structures that speakers use to assign and manipulate reference across different domains. What this means is that when we talk, we're often navigating between various mental contexts or spaces to make sense of what's being said. This theory helps explain the idea of referential opacity, which is the notion that sometimes we choose to connect or not connect these different reference points, like between reality and someone's beliefs. So, it's a way of understanding how we handle references that aren't straightforward or literal. What's really interesting is that this approach unifies how we think about referential ambiguity, where a reference might be unclear, with other phenomena like presuppositions and counterfactuals. These are all aspects of language that involve shifting or managing different mental contexts. Ultimately, the theory emphasizes that meaning isn't just fixed or static. Instead, it's like a procedural recipe, something that guides us in constructing knowledge dynamically. It highlights the cooperative and flexible nature of language use, showing that understanding and communication involve actively building and navigating these mental spaces. This idea ties back to the overall theme of language as a powerful, adaptive tool for making sense of complex and layered information.